Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little different. The complete history of morphine, the miracle drug that eased battlefield agony and would later give rise to what came to be known as soldier's disease. Forget the neat heroic version of medical progress. Morphine's story is braided with the relief and innovation, but also with commerce, dependency, and unintended consequences. The truth is, set down in a crowded wartime ward with broken bones and nights of unending pain, you'd probably reach for the same relief those soldiers did, and that choice might change the rest of your life. Take a second to like and subscribe if this is the kind of content you enjoy, and in the comments share your location and the time where you are. I love seeing how far and wide our community reaches. Low lights, open mind. Let's follow the trail from opium fields to the front lines. They understood the poppy before they had a word for it, noticing the rounded pods, the latex-like amber that oozed from a deliberate cut, the peculiar heavy sweetness that softened the edges of pain and grief. In the mud-brick cities of Sumer and Akkad, 2.5 to 3 millennia before Christ, clay tablets record lists of plants and preparations. Later scholars would point to a phrase often translated as the joy plant, hulgil, as likely the distant echo of opium. Archaeologists have turned up seeds in iconography. There are Minoan frescoes on Crete, still bright in their faded pigments, that show poppy heads arrayed like offerings. Small, ancient proofs that whoever first learned to coax solace from Papaver somniferum did so in many places and in many rhythms, in hearths and temples and physicians' shops, over and over and over again. In Egypt, the Ebers Papyrus, compiled around 1550 BC but drawing on far older lore, lists poultices and potions for pain, for cough, for the restless night, and among its recipes lie preparations that scholars have long read as opiate in character. The opium that reached the Nile Valley carried other gifts with it, ritual uses and funerary connotations, a place in the pharmacopoeia that was part medicine, part incantation. India named it, catalogued it and taught it a place within the long, patient grammar of Ayurveda. Sanskrit texts refer to a hyphena. Sushruta and later compilers of medical law recommended poppy-based remedies for diarrhea, for coughs, for pain, and as sleep-inducing aids in the art of easing suffering. China, too, kept opium in its pharmacopoeia for centuries as a remedy, used to stitch shut wounds of anxiety and to quiet the stomach, long before pipes and smoke turned the plant into the social and political calamity that 18th and 19th century headlines would dramatize. The Greco-Roman world knew its uses without romanticizing them. Hippocratic practice used poppy-based preparations. Theophrastus and Dioscorides described the plant and its latex, noting its soporific analgesic powers. Dioscorides, whose Demeteria Medica would be a kitchen table companion for apothecaries for centuries, catalogued recipes, dosages, and contraindications. Galen refined the humoral logic around it, weighing opium's drying and cooling tendencies with the care of a physician who had learned to see the body as balance. When the Roman merchant ships moved east, they carried with them not only spices and silk, but jars and consignments of poppy latex, the networks of trade making certain that a potion brewed in Alexandria could be tasted in a doctor's house in Antioch, or a tavern in Gaul. Behind these uses lay an accumulation of simple, repeatable techniques. A pre-modern apothecary did not think in molecules, but in textures and temperatures, in macerations and infusions, in decoctions and tinctures. To make laudanum, by the time the name settled onto opium tincture in the later centuries, one steeped opium in alcohol, sometimes with spices, and bottled the result for bedside use. To ease the stomach of a seafarer, or to quiet the feverish night of a small child, an apothecary would weigh his powders, macerate, strain, and hand over a dose measured in drops or grains. The uncertainty of composition was accepted because there was no alternative. Across the Mediterranean, practitioners learned how to reduce and concentrate plant juices, how to clarify them, how to temper their strength with wine or honey. A recipe in a monastery garden might be mirrored centuries later by an herbalist in Baghdad, or a surgeon in Toledo. What changed was not always the substance, but the confidence with which it was applied. and the networks by which that confidence travelled, the translation schools of the Islamic world, the monasteries of medieval Europe that copied recipe books, the Renaissance apothecaries who began to think with a new hunger for order. Here, in the dusty scriptoria and the smoky apothecaries, the pharmacological groundwork was being laid. The technical knowledge mattered: how to slice a capsule, how to dry latex into a dark, waxy mass that could be powdered, how to dissolve and to redissolve, how to measure in cups and scales, and later in grains and fractions. Traders learned to bundle this merchandise, opium bound into cakes, sealed in resinous cloth, waxed in clay jars, and move it across borders, from the fields of Anatolia and Crete to the ports of Alexandria and Antioch, from the riverine markets of the Indus to the fjords and estuaries where Venetian galleys took on silk and spices and sometimes carefully wrapped opium itself. The Silk Road threaded communities together. The Mediterranean's Daboon sea lane braided them. The Ottoman administrative complex in the early modern period would license and tax the production in certain provinces, folding the poppy into the ledger of the state. Trade routes laid not only cargo but practice. A recipe from Alexandria might be copied by an apothecary in Lyon. An extract practiced in China might be mimicked in a Genoese shop. The material culture of opium, its jars, its knives, its scoops, moved with it, and so did the idea that a plant's power could be concentrated, transported, and farmed as a commodity. Medieval and early modern Europe absorbed and reshaped this inheritance. Islamic physicians such as Rhazes and Avicenna wrote about opium with an empirical insistence. Avicenna's canon of medicine, completed in the early 11th century, became a standard for centuries in the Muslim world and, through translations, in the Latin West. Medical knowledge translated in Toledo and Sicily in the 12th and 13th centuries sent Arabic pharmacology north into Paris and Bologna, feeding the medieval universities and later the apothecaries who clustered outside them. With the printing press, the recipes multiplied more quickly. Paracelsus in the 16th century, impatient with scholastic medicine, urged physicians to attend laboratories and tinctures rather than merely texts. He taught a more chemical attitude toward remedies, an attitude that would resound through generations of chemists who thought of potency as something to be adjusted and measured. In the 17th century, Thomas Sydenham, the English physician sometimes called the English Hippocrates, promoted laudanum as a broadly useful medicine, and physicians like Sydenham's successors used opium in an expanding range of conditions. Laudanum, in these years, was a catch-all in a world before antibiotics and before anaesthesia, an effective, portable, and intoxicating medicine for the cough, the fever, the sleeplessness. The bottles that went home with patients and sailors and soldiers carried a concentrated bite of a tradition that stretched back to the temples and gardens of the ancient Near East. This slow accretion of practice, the recipes, the tinctures, the compendia, mattered because it kept opium in circulation as something doctors trusted, and because it provided a framework within which a later figure would think differently. The apothecary's long apprenticeship, the university lesson on materia medica, the circulating compendium, these were the invisible scaffolds upon which the idea of isolating an active principle could stand. To extract a single compound from an herbal matrix would require equipment and patience, but it would also require a worldview that suspected the existence of such a thing, a single, repeatable agent responsible for what the ancients had only described as the aggregate action of a drug. That suspicion lived in the heads of early chemists at the turn of the 19th century, feeding on the chemical revolution that had rearranged how people thought about substances and combinations. The story of morphine's isolation opens in a quiet German town rather than in a thunderous laboratory. Friedrich Wilhelm Adam Serturner was not the court chemist of a sovereign prince. He was an apothecary's apprentice, a meticulous, stubborn young man in Paderborn, and in 1803 he began to pursue a conviction that had become the new hope of natural philosophers, that among the messy mixtures of nature there lived a few pure, crystalline substances that could be plucked out and studied in isolation. He worked with opium as others had worked with tinctures and powders for centuries, but he differed in temperament and in ambition. Where earlier hands had been satisfied with tincture and decoction, Sir Turner wanted a stable, countable agent, something that could be weighed and dosed and above all reproduced. He succeeded in ways that startled his contemporaries. Using the chemical thinking available to him, acidic and alkaline manipulations, repeated crystallization and washing, patient observation, he produced a white, bitter, crystalline substance that, when administered, produced the characteristic opium effects: sleep, analgesia, and a peculiar euphoria. Sir Turner named it morphium, invoking Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams, because sleep seemed to be its signature. The act of naming was itself an assertion. Where many had seen opium as a single composite remedy, Sir Turner declared that a distinct chemical principle lay at its heart. He published his findings, drawing attention not by bluster, but by careful report of experiments, including, for the brave and occasionally reckless tradition of the time, self-experimentation. He measured, he noted, and he insisted that this pure substance could reproduce the power of opium without the bulk or variability of the crude latex. Sir Turner's discovery arrived in a historical moment that was ready to receive it. The late 18th and early 19th centuries had seen chemistry grow from the workbench curiosities of gentlemen amateurs into an analytic, systematic discipline. Antoine Lavoisier had rewritten chemical nomenclature and dispelled phlogiston. The quiet rigour of laboratories in Paris, Giessen and Göttingen was training a generation of chemists to think about elements, compounds, and reactions as problems that yielded to experiment and calculation. A young chemist in Germany could read translated works from Paris and London and know that a discovery of Sir Turner's kind would be significant. It promised a new method for taming the caprice of plants and turning them into reliable instruments for the clinic. The initial reception of Sir Turner's morphium was mixed, curiosity laced with scepticism. That a solitary apothecary could isolate a substance and name it seemed almost presumptuous in an age when academies and salons still had cultural authority. But other chemists repeated Sir Turner's work, sometimes with more refined techniques and sometimes by accident, and in the decades that followed, the idea of extracting active principles from plants became a standard goal. One by one, chemists isolated quinine from cinchona bark, strychnine, caffeine and codeine. The field of alkaloid chemistry bloomed, alkaloids being the class of nitrogen-containing basic compounds that included many of these potent natural products. Each new isolation validated Sir Turner's method and shifted medicine's confidence from the imprecise but time-trusted tincture toward the prospect of pure compounds whose dose and effect could be specified. The name changed too in the crossing languages. Morphium became morphine in the Anglophone tongues, the gentle Latinized suffix yielding to a sharper, more clinical ending. Morphine's crystalline form made it tangible. A doctor could now speak of a milligram of morphine the way a judge might speak of a pound of coin. The specificity felt modern. But the technique that produced those crystals remained artisanal at first, a sequence of careful separations guided by taste and smell and the sort of sensory expertise an apothecary developed over years. The chemistry that Sir Turner had used, forming salts, dissolving and recrystallizing, seeking purity through repeated washing, became the template for other natural product work. It was, in its way, the first step towards separating pharmacology from folklore. The single-mindedness of isolating an active principle inaugurated an era in which materials from the plant kingdom would be measured, standardized and commodified. If Sir Turner opened a door, 19th century chemistry widened the corridor. Crystallization became not just a demonstration of purity, but an industrial clue. Crystals could be weighed, labelled, packaged and sold. By the 1820s and 1830s, commercial houses in Germany such as E. Merck in Darmstadt began to see alkaloids as a new commercial opportunity. Heinrich Emanuel Merck and others recognized that a stable substance reliably produced could be shipped in labelled bottles to physicians across Europe and to colonies and ports far away. Laboratories moved from the solitary bench to the factory floor, and university chairs and chemical departments trained technicians who would staff these emerging enterprises. The pedagogy of chemistry, Liebgen Gießen among the first to systematize laboratory instruction, meant that a young man could be taught the chemical techniques necessary to produce reliable alkaloids at scale. This was not the same as the mass industrial production of the 20th century, but it was a decisive step away from the unpredictability of tinctures and toward reproducible pharmaceutical products. Two technical developments mattered in particular. First, chemists learned to characterize compounds beyond taste and crystal form, measuring melting points, observing solubility profiles in different solvents, and determining reactivity with acids and bases. These data, recorded and shared in journals and pharmacopoeias, allowed chemists to speak the same language across borders, informal standardization before legal codification took hold. Second, the chemists of the 19th century discovered that many of the biologically active compounds in plants were more soluble and more readily administered when converted to salts, acidic additions that made compounds dissolve in water and therefore be injected, dripped or swallowed in aqueous solution. Morphine's chemistry allowed for such salts. Morphine sulfate, morphine hydrochloride, and other bars could be made into crystals that dissolved in water. The practical effect of that knowledge was profound. A soluble morphine salt could be prepared into an injectable solution. It could be poured into vials and shipped with instructions. It could be dosed more accurately than a glob of opium pasted into a capsule. The salt forms were not merely chemical curiosities, they were the hinge on which medicine swung into a new economy. The rise of the hypodermic syringe then completed the transformation in ways that no single chemist intended. In 1853, a French surgeon named Charles Pravaz and, independently in the same year, a Scottish physician, Alexander Wood, developed devices for injecting substances beneath the skin. The story, softly told, is about instruments honed to bring medication directly to the bloodstream or tissues, rather than depending on the slow, capricious mediation of digestion. The syringe turned morphine from an oral or topical remedy into a rapid, potent agent of immediate relief. A field surgeon could now deliver pain relief that was swift and visible. A mother could be given a controlled dose in labour. A patient in a London hospital could be eased into sleep in a matter of minutes. You can imagine the scene: a small bottle, the crystalline powder dissolved into a clear solution, a syringe glinting in candlelight or under the pale gas of a ward, a needle finding the hollow of an arm. It was the sort of practical alchemy that made doctors feel empowered and, for a time, miraculous. But it also made morphine more efficient at what it did, easing pain and producing a comforting dimming of reality. And efficiency has consequences when it comes to habit and dependence. The 19th century, with its factories and steamships, with its rapid communication and growing literacy, found new markets. Pharmacies in Paris and London began to stock bottled morphine salts and pre-weighed powders. Advertising creeped in, and commercial catalogues listed morphine alongside strychnine, quinine, and other chemical products. The compounding apothecary, once an artisan or hobo, became the first industrial pharmacist, buying raw opium and packaged alkaloids from chemical houses and combining them into prescribed medicines or sales over the counter. The scale of trade increased accordingly. Opium still moved in its older forms, cakes and lumps shipped by sea from India, from the Ottoman lands, from the Mediterranean hinterlands. But now the end product was often not the crude latex, but the alkaloid extracted from it. European ports saw consignments of crystallized morphine, and its salts packed with labels in German, French and English. The British East India Company, which had controlled opium production and trade in India for colonial profit, remained a central artery in this system. The politics of opium and empire would be writ large in the opium wars with China in the mid-19th century, but there was also a quieter commercial corridor that delivered raw and refined substances to Europe and to the Americas. In the United States, apothecaries in Boston and Philadelphia stocked laudanum and morphine. The young industries of the Northeast found uses for the drug in textiles of health and domestic life. It was easy to obtain. It was legal. It was for many a convenient balm. Standardization crept into the pharmacopoeia as more laboratories contributed data. Dose units shifted from vague tinctural measures, a drop or a drachm, to grains and then to milligrams as weighing instruments became more precise. Pharmacopoeias, the official compendia that listed approved preparations and their specifications, began to include morphine salts with explicit descriptions of appearance and potency. The language of medicine had been leaning toward numbers for decades, but here was a clear instance in which chemical analysis, industrial production, and clinical practice met. Doctors could, in principle, write for X grains of morphine sulfate, and pharmacists could satisfy that request more reliably than before. There was a dark irony in the success. What had been a reassuringly ancient remedy, an herbalist's tincture, had become a product of laboratories and factories, an instance of modernity's promise that problems could be solved by technique and scale. The same forces that allowed a surgeon to stop a patient's pain on a battlefield also made possible the quiet progression from a therapeutic to a habitual use. War would be a blunt demonstration of that fact. In the American Civil War, for instance, surgeons used morphine widely to treat the wounds, amputations, and fevers of the conflict. The hypodermic syringe was available, field tents abounded with opiates, and the need for pain relief after a day of violence was enormous. When veterans returned home, some came bearing scars, and some came bearing a new dependency that they and their physicians, for all their good intentions, had not understood as a distinct public health problem. The term soldier's disease would appear in medical commentaries in the late 19th century, an awkward euphemism for the fact that those who had been treated faithfully for their wounds during the war had been exposed to an efficient agent of relief that could, in its wake, leave an enduring compulsion. By the mid to late 19th century, then, morphine had completed a curious arc. It had been known for millennia in one form or another. It had been coaxed into the modern idea of a single active principle by the labours of a provincial German apothecary named Sir Turner, and it had been transformed by the apparatus of industrial chemistry into a commodity that could be standardised, marketed, and injected. Pharmacies multiplied. Chemical houses like Merck sold labels and catalogues. Compendia gave rules. Medicine acquired tools that made suffering manageable in ways ancestors would have prized as miraculous. Yet in that success was a shadow. Efficiency and repeatability, hallmarks of progress, had also sharpened a drug's capacity to create the very dependency physicians sought to prevent. It was not that morphine had changed its nature so much as that humanity had amplified its reach. The 19th century ended with morphine sitting, almost contentedly, as a fixture of clinics and households alike. Jars of laudanum rested in parlours. Glass vials of morphine salts filled chemists' cabinets. The chemical language around it became precise. The physical form, crystalline, white, bitter, became an emblem of a new pharmacology that prized certainty. And yet the histories that follow this era will have to reckon with consequences that are not only clinical but social. How an emblem of relief could become an engine of dependence in contexts ranging from the trenches and the wards to the quiet rooms of returnees and patients whose chronic pain offered no easy exit. For now, in these slow, careful years, the groundwork had been laid. A plant's resin turned into a compound turned into a marketed product, and a product folded into the routines of modern medicine. It was, in the language of the time, a triumph of analytical chemistry. It was, in the language of ordinary life, a new comfort, one that would soon teach the world with an uncomplaining inevitability difficult lessons about the costs of convenience. In the dim, oil-lit consulting rooms of mid-Victorian medicine, a small revolution took hold, quiet as a bent needle, precise as a thread. The hypodermic syringe did not announce itself with canon or decree. It crept into practice the way a sapling pushes through pavement by persistent, intimate pressure. The first literal piercing of the body with a hollow needle is usually traced, with a kind of affectionate embarrassment, to Francis Rinde in Dublin in 1804, who, faced with a patient in an intractable neuralgia, fashioned a crude instrument to deposit a solution of painkiller beneath the skin. It was not a grand moment, but a practical one. A physician confronted a human throat or cheek or limb, could not soothe it with words, and so he made a hole and put the remedy where the nerves lived. The idea was simple and ugly and brilliant in equal measure. It took the rest of the decade for clever hands in Paris and Edinburgh to smooth that crude proof into a working tool. In 1853, Alexander Wood in Edinburgh and Charles Pravaz in Lyon, working separately and without much mutual courtesy, transformed that idea into instruments worthy of a surgeon's tableau. Wood, practitioner, tinkerer, pedant, made a slender glass barrel and a hollow needle with a plunger that moved with the soft assurance of a metronome. He presented the thing as an answer to pain that might be lodged beneath the skin, or as he believed, in the tissues themselves. He spoke of targeted relief and of local afflictions soothed in the place that hurt. Pravaz, a French surgeon, forged a small screw-driven metal syringe that appealed to the practicalities of a hospital theatre and to those who liked the solid feel of steel. His early work was aimed at injecting sclerosing agents into varicose veins, not at quieting battlefield pain, but the machine's logic was the same. Between Rhine's needle, Wood's delicate glass device, and Pravaz's screw-plunger metalware, the hypodermic as we would recognise it was born and began its slow migration out from the workshops and into the wards. It is worth touching the instruments with the mind's hand. The glass barrel, a cold, clear cylinder, small enough to be hidden in a palm, its plunger gliding like a breath, the needle, a silver-thin compass tip that glinted when the lamplight struck it, the syringe's faint metallic tang and the quick little sound of air displaced. There was a precise intimacy in that contact. The medic could measure, could place, could watch a patient's face change within seconds. Pain in those seconds dissipated. The body's rawness retreated. The physician felt in turn a new and heady competence to reach in and alter not only symptom but sensation. What the hypodermic did clinically is simple to describe and complicated to reckon with. By bypassing the stomach and the slow chemistry of digestion, an injected dose of morphine began its work more rapidly and more completely than laudanum swallowed or a poultice applied. The mind felt it sooner, the nerves quieted. For surgeons and for patients, this was nearly miraculous. A man otherwise unspeakably occupied with agony could be steadied enough for an amputation, shuttered enough to consent to a procedure. For chronic sufferers, those whose lives had become architecture around recurring pain, the syringe offered relief that was both more reliable and more full-bodied than any previous nostrum. Many early case reports read like small confessions, a patient with tic douloureux, shrieking in the night, whose face relaxed at the second prick, an elderly woman bound by rheumatic torment, who slept for the first time in months, a soldier, after the blast and the belt of blood, who could, for a few hours, be someone other than a battlefield statistic. The revolution in delivery altered the drug as much as the drug altered care. Morphine had been chemically isolated by Friedrich Saturner in the first years of the 19th century, and then commodified by apothecaries and chemists across Europe. Once the needle offered a reliable route of entry, the same molecule that had once dulled pain through the digestive tract now arrived with speed and intensity that no one had expected. Physicians saw with something like childlike delight how quickly relief could come when the barrier of the gut was skirted. They used less for the same effect. Some thought they were exercising precision. Others, less sanguine, observed that the effect was different in quality. Not merely analgesia, but an effacing warmth. A short-lived euphoria that seemed to lodge in an injured man's mind and to linger beyond the immediate crisis. The clinical literature of the 1850s and 1860s is full of arguments, gentle scholarly fisticuffs, over what the syringe did. Alexander Wood insisted that injections worked primarily by virtue of their local placement. For him, an injection into the tissue near the nerve was a direct, focused therapy. In London, Charles Hunter and others argued otherwise, suggesting the drug's primary action was systemic. The needle, they said, was simply a more efficient method of introducing the medicine to the body at large. The debate mattered less than the fact of the tool's adoption. Whether local or systemic, morphine via the hypodermic was faster and, in practice, more dependable than previous methods. Surgeons came to rely on it. General practitioners found it a discreet, effective way to calm a terrified patient before a small operation, or to soothe a woman in childbirth who had not been soothed by chloroform. Hospitals stocked syringes. Pharmacies sold pre-made solutions. The technology fit into the rhythms of medical practice, and the rhythms changed accordingly. It would be tidy to imagine that the sterilized, time-tested nostrum arrived together with an understanding of its dangers. It did not. Joseph Lister's antiseptic protocols, which would transform surgical sterility, were years away from wide adoption when hypodermics entered common use. The glass and steel that delivered the morphine could also carry infection. Abscesses and complications followed some injections, and the medical literature recorded such harms with the same steady eye it recorded the relief. But there was also an older moral language circulating the wards that had trouble with the new chemistry, the idea that pain was to be endured, that endurance had spiritual value. The syringe made that argument less tenable. It let pain be a practical problem, solvable with technique and dosage. The moralists grumbled. The practical surgeons rejoiced. The first surgical case studies give a sense of the new calculus. In Edinburgh, Wood described cases of tic douloureux and other nerve pains alleviated by subcutaneous morphine. In Lyon, Pravaz's instruments began turning up in vascular surgery and in the hands of obstetricians seeking new ways to control hemorrhage and spasmodic pain. In Parisian hospitals, surgeons used injected morphine as an adjunct to ether or chloroform. It softened the edges of surgery and reduced the need for repeated doses of inhaled anesthetics. By the late 1850s, the syringe had moved into the clinic and into the field, a portable comfort in a world that still moved largely by muscle and steam. The change was technical, but it was also social, a small machine that altered who could be soothed and how quickly. If the hypodermic gave doctors a new power inside the body, war gave them the statistical experiment in which to test it. The middle decades of the 19th century were cruel laboratories. The Crimean War opened in 1853, and within a few years the American continent would pull itself into the grinding engines of the Civil War. In conflict, the new tools meet their true scale. The Crimean campaign, remembered for bungled logistics and for a public outcry about the suffering of soldiers, sits at a hinge in this story. The war began almost in the same breath as the hypodermic's invention. Its surgeons relied on traditional analgesics, laudanum, poultices, chloroform for operations, and on the improvisations of ambulance and hospital systems that were, frankly, inadequate. Florence Nightingale's campaigns to reorganise nursing and to clean wards arose out of that dysfunction. Yet even in Crimea, the idea of targeted, immediate analgesia had been planted. There are testimonies of morphine used in various forms, and reports of field surgeons devising rudimentary injections. The full flowering, though, came with the American Civil War. Between 1861 and 1865, the United States mobilized hundreds of thousands of men in armies that would fight sustained battles and leave wounds unlike the skirmishes of earlier centuries. The scale of surgical intervention was unprecedented. Amputations were frequent and often performed under the light of field tents. Bullet extractions and compound fracture management were routine. The logistics of caring for the wounded required a new coordination of transport, triage and supply. Jonathan Letterman, the medical director of the Army of the Potomac in 1862, created an ambulance corps and a triage system that, for the first time in American warfare, attempted to get the wounded off the field efficiently and into organised hospitals. This structural innovation mattered to morphine distribution. A functioning ambulance meant that the wounded could be stabilised sooner, often with analgesic, and that those stabilisations were repeated as casualties moved through trains, riverboats, and the wards of hospitals near Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. The Army Medical Department, first under Clement Finley and then under Surgeon General William A. Hammond, appointed in 1862, had to supply this new circulatory system of care. Procurement moved from sutlers and odd lots to large organised purchases. rivers and rail lines became arteries not only of men but of medicines. Morphine in various formulations was packed into crates and bottles and became part of the standard accoutrement of the surgeon's kit. The names of particular hospitals, Armory Square Hospital in Washington, for example, which received thousands of wounded from the battles along the Eastern Theatre, or the ad hoc facilities that ringed the great railroad depots, enter the record not as places of drama but as nodes in networks, places where supplies arrived and where procedures were repeated until patterns emerged. On that repeated practice hung the problem. A man might be given morphine in a field tent, then again on the journey to a general hospital, again in the amphitheatre before an amputation, again in the ward to sleep. The hypodermic made these repetitions easier because a small, precise dose brought near instant relief. Soldiers, grateful and bewildered, came to rely on the needle's economy of comfort. The sedation that followed an injection had a social value. It softened both pain and panic, made an operation possible, calmed the family who watched from far away, and allowed the state to return a heavier fraction of its human capital to some form of utility. The surgeon could perform his work with less protest. The patient could endure. For a time, that was the highest good. The denominators of scale, the number of wounded, the number of amputations, the capacity of hospital wards, are where the clinical practice becomes social history. By the close of the Civil War, the experience of repeated, medically sanctioned morphine use was no longer anecdotal, it was structural. The Army's records, the journals of men like John Shaw Billings, who documented the medical statistics of the conflict, show a system in which narcotics were in continuous use. Surgeons such as Frank H. Hamilton and general practitioners who tended veterans afterwards commented on the ubiquity of morphine. The drug did its immediate job well. In doing so, it introduced a population, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, into a sustained pharmacological relationship with opiates that they had neither sought nor understood in full. It is crucial to separate blunt moralizing from the clinical fact. Many of those addicted did not arrive at their habit by choice, in any moral sense the period's moralists used. They arrived because modern medicine had opened a door, and because circumstances, war, acute injury, repeated surgery kept them going through it. Yet the shape of public discourse rarely made room for such nuance. When veterans returned home from war with tremors, with a craving for their nightly needle, with a life rearranged by the needs of withdrawal, a new category entered American and British newspapers and medical commentary: soldier's disease. The phrase itself is less important than the fact it named a pattern, a recognition that the exposure of men to morphine in medical settings seemed strongly associated with later addiction. It was not a name of sympathy only, it was a term freighted with ambivalence. Physicians such as S. Weir Mitchell in Philadelphia recorded cases of what he termed morphinism and sought to describe the clinical course, the initial therapeutic use, the building of tolerance, the despairing need of a man when the drug was withheld. Mitchell, who treated nervous injuries and later undertook long essays on the nervous system, gave voice to a clinical compassion that insisted on seeing addiction as a pathological sequel to treatment rather than a mere moral failing. Others disagreed. The newspapers were less temperate. They told stories of returned soldiers, broken men, easily turned into cautionary tales about the decay of character in the post-war years. The temperance movement and philanthropic societies used such stories to argue for broader moral reform, while some physicians argued for institutional cures and others recommended palliative maintenance. Where medical thinking leaned, the law and public policy hesitated. In many places, morphine remained a legal substance, sold through apothecaries and sometimes dispensed casually. The 1860s and 1870s were not the age of narcotics legislation. They were the age of case study and of professional debate. Some hospitals experimented with tapering, gradually reducing the amount of morphine a patient received, hoping to wean them from pharmacological dependence. Others abandoned the pretense of cure and simply replaced morphine with other sedatives at the physician's discretion. A few experimental practitioners attempted hypnotism, mesmeric techniques then fashionable among some medical circles, to blunt cravings during withdrawal. None of these methods offered a reliable or humane pathway out of dependence for many veterans. Social institutions, military pensions, charitable homes, asylums found themselves pressed to respond. The state's response was ambivalent. The very institutions that had medicated needed to decide whether a dependence acquired in service merited compensation or whether it would be considered a failure of character and denied. The stigma attached to the soldier's disease was double-edged. On one hand, there was a grudging empathy. The addict had served, had been wounded, had been cared for by the same state that now recoiled at his visible dependence. On the other hand, there was a moralizing impulse, a belief that character could and should be remade through discipline. For veterans seeking pensions or employment, the diagnosis could be ruinous. Employers worried about the reliability of men returned from the front. Families, if they could, concealed what they could not cure. Women addicted to opiates, who had often been given laudanum for childbirth or for chronic illness, faced a different sort of opprobrium. Their dependence was read through gendered lines that shaped both access to treatment and social pity. Institutional responses multiplied in the decades after the war. Hospitals and private homes opened clinics or offered periods of enforced sobriety. Religious charities ran homes that mixed spiritual exhortation with rest and simpler therapeutics. By the 1870s and 1880s, a market for cures matured. Some of these were earnest and humane, others were salesmanship dressed as science. Dr. Leslie Keely's later double chloride cure, which promised deliverance from drunkenness and morphine habit alike, is an example of the post-war environment in which science, commerce and public hunger for solutions combined. Keely's clinics are a story for later decades, and their quackery is easy to mock in retrospect. But they also reveal the demand for remediation that governmental and medical institutions were not yet equipped to provide. The professional medical discourse, meanwhile, slowly shifted away from casting addiction solely as sin and began to see it as a physiological process. 19th century neurologists and psychiatrists wrote clinical descriptions that put the phenomenon into the language of disease, tolerance, withdrawal, altered temperament. That shift was incomplete, contested, and took many forms across the Atlantic. In Britain, the discourse included imperial dimensions, how to manage opiate use in India and among colonial soldiers, while in America it entwined with veterans' politics and with a nascent public health sensibility. The old moral denunciations did not vanish. They softened, at least in some medical circles, into a therapeutic ambition to provide care for those whose nervous systems had been rewritten by chemical intervention. This rewriting had practical consequences. Physicians, increasingly aware of the risk their treatments entailed, began to advise restraint. Surgical practice changed as well. The availability of effective measured analgesia made some forms of surgery more humane, while its wider use forced the profession to confront the long-term sequelae of that relief. Hospitals, now sites of both cure and chronicity, accumulated records of dependence that would, by the close of the century, feed into a more organised public health and regulatory response. But those responses were delayed, imperfect, and often suffused with the age's moral rhetoric. The story of morphine's ascent and of soldier's disease is, in the end, a medical parable about the unlooked-for costs of efficacy. The hypodermic syringe, so small and skillful, delivered a promise that unbearable pain could be mastered. It kept that promise, often in the gentlest way possible. But as it did so, it produced new vulnerabilities, especially on the vast and brutal stage of 19th century warfare. The soldiers who first tasted relief were not addicts by inclination. They were recipients of a good that modern medicine offered at scale. When dependence followed, the social reaction was to wonder whether the state that had soothed could also be held to the duty of curing. There is a peculiar, darkly comic insistence in history that our finest engines of care sometimes create the problems only subsequent reform can solve. The hypodermic made pain legible as a technical problem and solved it with beautiful efficiency. War multiplied the practice until the consequences could no longer be hidden in the margins of casebooks. The phrase soldier's disease captured a nation's uneasy admission that sometimes the tools of salvation bring their own forms of bondage. In the lull that follows this recognition, medicine and society began, haltingly, to build responses. Treatment regimens, debates about compensation, nascent regulation, that would, in the long arc of medical history, reshape both how drugs are used and how we think about the people who depend on them. The story is not one of villainy so much as of complexity. The syringe, the surgeon, the soldier, the state, all tangled in a new chemistry of care that taught everyone involved a costly lesson about relief, responsibility, and the fragile calculus of human suffering. In the intimate theatre of the synapse, morphine plays its part as a gentle tyrant, small, precise, convincing. At the molecular level, this is not poetry but mechanism. Morphine binds most avidly to the mu-opioid receptor, the MOR, a G-protein-coupled receptor, encoded by the OPA-M1 gene. And when it occupies that receptor, it turns down the volume of pain signalling and turns the lights low on alarm circuits. Bound to MOR, the GI-GO proteins fall silent to hidden nylyl cyclase, reducing intracellular camp. Simultaneously, GIV-GIGU subunits nudge open inwardly, rectifying potassium channels and close N-type voltage-gated calcium channels. The result is electrical dampening. Presynaptic terminals release less substance P and glutamate, and postsynaptic neurons resist firing. In the spinal dorsal horn, where primary nociceptive afferents meet second-order neurons, this biochemical choreography blunts the relay of acute nociceptive information up the spinothalamic tract. In the periaqueductal grey and rostral ventromedial medulla, the same receptor-mediated inhibition engages descending pathways that further inhibit pain transmission. It is a multi-layered blockade. Morphine acts both at the gate and on the messenger, slowing the tide of noxious impulses and reshaping the experience of suffering. But morphine does more than alter the arithmetic of pain. The mu receptor is sprinkled through limbic structures and brainstem nuclei, and when morphine latches there, it alters mood and motive. In the ventral tegmental area, morphine inhibits GABAergic interneurons, and by silencing these breaks, it disinhibits dopaminergic neurons that project to the nucleus accumbens. Dopamine rises, reward signaling swells, and a soothing, sometimes radiant sense of relief and pleasure can wash over a frightened body. That is why morphine does not only quiet pain, it quiets the fear that wraps around pain. It rewires suffering into a softer narrative. The same molecule also presses against the medullary respiratory centres. In the pre-Butzinger complex and other brainstem respiratory pacemakers, morphine reduces responsiveness to carbon dioxide and hypoxia, slowing the impetus to breathe. A patient on too much morphine can breathe shallowly, miss the signal of rising CO2, and slip toward hypoventilation. Death by respiratory arrest is the sombre, clinical end of that pharmacology. And then there is the intestine, the ancient nervous system within the gut. Mu receptors in the enteric plexuses reduce peristaltic contractions, tighten sphincters, inhibit secretions. The clinical consequence is constipation, so reliable in effect that clinicians historically called it morning after for morphine. Pupils contract, meiosis, because parasympathetic tone to the iris is unmasked, and many other autonomic threads are pulled. Nausea through area postrema stimulation, histamine release causing pruritus and vasodilation, and long-term endocrine modulation that can blunt the gonadal axis, reducing testosterone and disturbing menstruation. Pharmacokinetics writes its own rules over this pharmacology. Morphine administered intravenously arrives almost instantly to the brain. A subcutaneous injection comes on a little more slowly. Oral morphine appears later and is much less efficient because the liver clips a large portion in first-pass metabolism. The liver does not merely destroy morphine, it transforms it. The principal pathway is glucuronidation by UGT2-BAVN, producing morphine-3-glucuronide, M3G, and morphine-6-glucuronide, M6G. M6G retains analgesic potency, sometimes impressively so, whereas M3G is largely non-analgesic, and at higher concentrations can promote agitation or neuroexcitation. The kidneys clear these metabolites, and when renal function falters, M6G accumulates, and the clinical balance can shift toward prolonged sedation or respiratory depression. Morphine's plasma half-life is modest, a couple of hours in most adults. But the pharmacodynamic echoes last longer, because repeated occupation of receptors alters the brain. That alteration is the clinical fulcrum of dependence. With repeated exposure, the mu receptor and its signaling pathways undergo desensitization. GRK's phosphorylate receptors, V-arrestins, are recruited, receptors are internalized, and downstream systems compensate. Adenylyl cyclase can be upregulated. Second messenger cascades recalibrated. Tolerance becomes evident. Doses that once relieved pain begin to do less, and patients or users need more to achieve the same analgesic or euphoric effect. Tolerance is partly receptor level, partly downstream, partly behavioral. The context of administration, cues associated with dosing, and learned expectations all shape apparent tolerance. Cross-tolerance links morphine to other opioids. Clinical substitution is possible because of shared receptor pharmacology. But there is another, darker plasticity. With chronic opioid exposure, the nervous system may become more sensitive to nociceptive inputs, the condition known as opioid-induced hyperalgesia. NMDA receptor signaling, microglial activation, and maladaptive synaptic changes conspire so that more opioid can paradoxically produce worse pain. In clinical terms, the physician faces a dreadful paradox: escalate therapy and risk respiratory depression and worsening sensitivity, or withhold and allow the patient needless suffering. Dependence is the expected biological offset to chronic exposure. It is not synonymous with addiction, though the two are often confused in both lay and clinical talk. Physical dependence means that a set of homeostatic changes has become a new baseline. Take the drug away, and the system snaps back through a cascade of signs and symptoms. Withdrawal from morphine is unmistakable and uniquely theatrical in its physiology. The locus coeruleus, a noradrenergic hub, fires with disinhibited intensity, flooding the organism with sympathetic overdrive, tachycardia, sweating, piloerection. Patients complain of bone and muscle pains, of yawning spasms that seem to come from the bones, of abdominal cramping and diarrhea as a mindless gut reawakens, of rhinorrhea and lacrimation, of restlessness and insomnia, and of a psychological hollowness, anxiety, dysphoria, craving. In short-acting morphine users, withdrawal can begin within 6 to 12 hours and reach a fevered peak over the next day or two before slowly resolving over a week. Long-acting formulations delay onset and stretch the discomfort over weeks. Biochemically, the withdrawal is a mirror image of tolerance. Where mu signaling was once under the influence of morphine, the sudden absence unmasks the upregulated adenylyl cyclase and noradrenergic tone. Clinicians deploy clonidine to temper the noradrenergic storm, and they use methadone or buprenorphine to replace or stabilize opioid signaling more gradually, allowing the body to recover without the violence of abrupt withdrawal. Naloxone and naltrexone opioid antagonists can immediately precipitate withdrawal if given to a dependent person. Clinically, that abrupt, precipitated withdrawal is itself dangerous and distressing. Why does dependence develop even under therapeutic use? The answer is in the intersection of homeostasis and human necessity. Pain is a persistent, sometimes intractable business. Chronic conditions, cancer, arthritis, neuropathy, demand ongoing control. Morphine, because it softens both the nociceptive signals and the emotional hurt, is a powerful ally in that work. But with repeated doses, the brain recalibrates to the presence of the drug as a new normal. Even carefully titrated, physician-supervised therapy nudges neurochemistry into dependence if it continues long enough. Individual vulnerability varies. Genetics, comorbid psychiatric disease, a prior history of substance use, age, liver and kidney function, social context. But none of those are absolute requirements. The pharmacokinetic route matters too. Parenteral administration, particularly intravenous delivery, reaches the brain quickly and provides a steep reinforcement schedule. That rapid onset accelerates associative learning and reward pathways and increases the likelihood of addictive patterns. So does the relief of psychic pain, where morphine is used to quiet not only suffering from an injured limb, but also the existential ache of loneliness or trauma. The psychological reinforcement is potent. The clinician's task is therefore both biochemical and humane, to manage dose and route, to monitor for tolerance and hyperalgesia, and to attend to the psychosocial threads that knotted the patient to the medicine in the first place. While laboratories and wards learned the molecule's modes, the household learned a different language. Laudanum was the domestic face of opium. It had entered European practice centuries earlier, a tincture of opium steeped in alcohol and spices, and by the 17th and 18th centuries, prescriptions and recipes circulated in common parlance. Paracelsus had coined terms, and Thomas Sydenham in 17th century England popularised tinctures for pain and spasm, and later still the poet and addict Thomas de Quincey wrote his Confessions of an English Opium Eater in 1821, a readable, notorious admission that did much to exoticize laudanum in the public imagination. Laudanum sat on kitchen shelves and nightstands. It was the remedy for cough and colic, for the fretting of teething infants and the trembling of menstrual pain, for insomnia, for nervous conditions that doctors politely labelled hysteria or melancholia. It was mixed, measured, spooned, a few drops in tea, a teaspoon of cordial, an elixir for the household and a sop for the weary. Patent medicines rode laudanum's popularity and amplified it. In Victorian hotels and in American parlours, cardboard boxes and glass vials promised cure-alls. Dalby's carminative, Godfrey's cordial, paregoric, and in the United States, the notorious Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. These were marketed with bold claims, with trade cards and testimonials, with lithographs that showed contented babies or miraculously cheerful mothers, and the fine print, when it existed, hid the active ingredient under euphemism. Soothing, cathartic for the nerves, such language disguised morphine and opium as maternal aids. Dosing myths spread because measurement was both imprecise and trustful. A teacup measure became a household spoon, became a tablespoon, and no pharmacy board demanded a standard. Many of these concoctions relied on alcohol as much as on opiates. The double anaesthetic effect entrenched both habit and the cultural belief that a sedated infant was healthier than an aching sleepless one. The result, heartbreakingly and predictably, was infant mortality and long-term dependence for some children who survived. In Britain and the United States, midwives, mothers and apothecaries formed an ecosystem of domestic medicine where laudanum was a common currency. Gender shaped this economy. Women were disproportionately pictured as both consumers and victims of patent remedies. Victorian medicine conceived of female frailty and female troubles as a large market, and the market responded with tonics, nervines, and soothing syrups. Physicians and apothecaries prescribed opiates to ease the travails of childbirth and the burdens of household cares. A society that expected women to bear emotional and domestic labour without complaint was predisposed perversely to medicate their quiet dissatisfactions. Working-class women who laboured in factories found in laudanum a brief reprieve from injury and exhaustion. Middle-class wives found in it a reprieve from social isolation and overwhelming domestic responsibility. In the case of Mr. de Quincey and the poets, opium could be framed as creative indulgence. In the parlour and the nursery, it was a pragmatic salve. That practicality, however, invited chronic self-medication. Because many ailments, teething, colic, nervousness, are episodic and recurrent, the elixir was taken repeatedly. Habit formed, dependence followed. The social penalties were uneven. A gentleman opium eater might be forgiven. A poor or female addict was often shamed. The scale of this domestic penetration was not trivial. Pharmacies stocked tinctures and paregorics. Travelling medicine peddlers carried vials by the dozen. Before the introduction of manufacturing standards in the late 19th century, a disparate supply chain meant variable potencies and variable risks. And then, in the middle of the 19th century, came a technological change that altered both the medicine and the epidemic, the hypodermic syringe. In 1853, Alexander Wood in Edinburgh, and independently, Charles Gabriel Prévaz in France developed practical syringes that allowed subcutaneous and intravenous administration. The syringe bypassed the gut and the liver, delivering morphine directly into the bloodstream and to the brain with speed and precision that made its subjective effects sharper and the reinforcement stronger. Once the needle entered common surgical and battlefield practice, and it did enter abruptly into the American Civil War and later into European military medicine, the dynamics of dependence shifted. Soldiers who had been wounded and treated with injected morphine often found themselves struggling to relinquish the drug when the war ended. Soldier's disease became the phrase Americans used in the 1860s and essays to describe the habit that followed those field hospitals. An addiction of scale among the veterans who had learned, in the fog of battle and the certainty of pain, that morphine brought immediate, reliable relief. Public anxiety about domestically available opiates, the hazard to infants, and the social costs of dependence did not produce a single response, but a long, uneven trajectory from private practice to public law. The 19th century did witness the first attempts to fix standards. Pharmacopoeias like the United States Pharmacopoeia, first published in 1820, and evolving British standards tried to codify doses and to define purity. Municipal health boards and pharmacists pushed for clearer labelling and for limits to the sale of poisons, but the patent medicine industry had ample legal and logistical wiggle room. Patent in name rarely meant patented in the modern sense. It meant protected in commerce and secret in formula. The scale of importation and manufacture grew in parallel. Opium for the European and American markets flowed from India, Turkey, and the Ottoman domains, under a complex web of imperial and commercial arrangements. By the late 19th century, chemists in pharmaceutical firms had learned to extract and crystallize morphine, rendering a powerful, transportable and marketable product. Pressure on governments increased in the late 19th and early 20th centuries from many directions. Missionaries and moral reformers decried opium smoking in colonial contexts and the social impact of drug use at home. Temperance activists linked alcohol and drug abuse and called for regulation. Physicians and public health officials reported infant deaths and chronic dependency that stemmed from patent remedies. Internationally, diplomats and reformers met in Shanghai in 1909 at the International Opium Commission, an event that would lead 3 years later to the International Opium Convention signed at The Hague in 1912. The first international treaty-oriented attempt to coordinate control over the global opium trade. The logic was at once humanitarian, national and imperial. Humanitarian because of the desire to reduce addiction and suffering, national because of anxieties about labour and order, and imperial because colonial governments depended on opium revenues even as they faced diplomatic and moral pressure to contain use. At home, reform found legislative muscle in the United States with 2 landmark laws that reshaped medicine and markets. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was a progressive-era statute that required truthful labelling of patent medicines and prohibited interstate commerce in misbranded and adulterated goods. For the first time, ingredients such as morphine and cocaine had to be declared on labels when present in significant quantities. It was a public health intervention disguised as consumer protection, and it undercut a large slice of the patent medicine economy by forcing disclosure. The law did not criminalise use, it demanded transparency. But the next step, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, shifted the terrain into taxation, registration, and criminal enforcement. Named for Representative Francis Burton Harrison, the Harrison Act required doctors, pharmacists and importers dealing with opium and coca products to register with the Treasury, to maintain detailed records, and to pay a special tax on transactions. In practice, it had teeth. Prosecutors and judges could use the paperwork requirement to clamp down on physicians prescribing maintenance doses to addicts, and the Act's interpretation in courts rapidly narrowed the space for medical maintenance. A physician who continued to prescribe morphine in a way that suggested non-therapeutic use could be prosecuted under tax statutes and accused of criminality. The motivations behind those laws were complex. They included public health imperatives and moral reformism, yes, but they also contained racial and political undertones. In the United States, anti-Chinese sentiment had been braided with loathing of opium smoking in the late 19th century. In the post-Civil War era, anxieties about race and order shaped drug policy in ways that cannot be reduced to health alone. International pressures, such as those raised by diplomats at the Shanghai Conference and in Hague negotiations, drove international commitments that domestic legislation had to reflect, and the newly influential professional bodies, like the American Medical Association, had ambivalent positions. Many physicians supported measures that restricted charlatanry and standardized practice, but they balked at restrictions that criminalized necessary therapeutic judgment. Enforcement practices blended bureaucracy and coercion. Records were examined, licenses revoked, and police raids became more common. Federal agents, often from Treasury and later from nascent narcotics bureaus, pursued distributors, and in municipal courts, addicts and small dealers faced penalties that ranged from fines to prison. A paradox emerged, where once an addict could purchase a tincture over the apothecary counter or obtain morphine from a sympathetic doctor, now registration and paperwork made those routes risky for physicians and pharmacists. Many doctors, faced with the legal peril of maintaining addicts, stopped prescribing at all. The supply to dependent patients that had been partly medical and partly domestic was cut off. Desperate users sometimes turned to the streets. The illicit market expanded to fill the void, with black market heroin and morphine orders circulating in urban networks. Those networks, in turn, bred criminal economies, violence, and adulterated supplies. The law that aimed to reduce harm sometimes produced other harms. Pharmaceutical industry decisions also interacted with regulation in ironic ways. Bayer had introduced diacetylmorphine, heroin, in 1898 as a cough suppressant and marketed it as a supposedly less addictive morphine substitute. The marketing error and later international control over heroin illustrate how the scientific idiom and the commercial idiom can diverge. As governments tightened legal supply lines, illicit suppliers and clandestine chemistry adapted. By the 1920s and 1930s, the criminalization of manufacture and distribution had produced substantial black markets for opioids in many cities. Enforcement energies were often unevenly applied. Racialized policing practices and selective prosecution meant that certain communities bore the brunt of punishment. The public health infrastructure that might have provided treatment for dependent patients was underdeveloped. Punishment was easier than therapy for many authorities. International treaties multiplied over the 20th century, codifying control and harmonizing law. The 1912 International Opium Convention initiated a cascade of treaties and commissions, and after the First World War, the League of Nations opium advisory bodies took up the task of standardizing lists of controlled substances. By mid-century, the United Nations and a web of conventions, culminating in the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and later agreements, placed opioids within a global regulatory architecture that sought to balance medical access and abuse prevention. But as always, policy produced contradictions in practice. Tight control in some places led to over-prescription in others. Criminal sanctions in many nations pushed users into unregulated markets. Disparities in access created regional mismatches where palliative care was hamstrung by fear of diversion. So the arc is familiar. Discovery and synthesis, domestic saturation and cultural normalization, scientific illumination of mechanism and harm, and then the legal and international attempt to control. Yet the story is not merely legal or biochemical, it is logistical and social. Prescription practices are shaped by packaging and labelling, by advertising and by the weight of cultural expectations about pain and who may express it. Railroads and steamships once moved barrels of opium from colonial plantations to metropolitan pharmacies. Chemists in Darmstadt, Basel, and New York industrialized extraction. patent medicine companies built distribution networks into parlours and living rooms. The needle and the desk shaped different epidemics, where the syringe and battlefield medicine created soldier's disease, the parlour spoon, and the soothing syrup created household dependence. Where the Pure Food and Drug Act mandated labels, the Harrison Act mandated registration. Where one sought informed consumers, the other pursued taxable commerce and criminal accountability. Both changed the scale of access. There are ironies that a bedside storyteller cannot resist whispering. The molecule that so reliably eased agony became, by the same chemistry, the source of new kinds of anguish. The household remedy that promised salvation to infants and mothers became, in quiet kitchen hours, a vector of chronic dependency. The law that sought to protect society sometimes pushed the sick into darker markets. History is rarely a moral parable with a single lesson. It is a palimpsest of good intentions overwritten by fear, commerce, and inadequate compassion. Yet the science is clear enough to guide a humane policy. Morphine relieves pain at the cost of altering the brain's homeostatic chemistry. It can be used safely when given with care, but it demands respect for its power to change bodies and behaviours. The 19th and early 20th centuries taught that the interplay of biology, commerce and law is delicate, and that a failure in any of those realms has a way of rippling outward. Listen then to the quiet detail, Ace. The mu receptor is literal, a pocket of protein in a cell membrane. The syringe is literal, glass and metal in a surgeon's hand. The patent medicine card is literal, inked and bright in a parlour. The statute is literal, printed and signed. Each of them is a hinge. Morphine's history turns upon those hinges. The molecule moved from opium poppy to village bottle to military ward to chemist's hand to the international treaty room, and at each stage societies recalibrated. Sometimes they did so with foresight, sometimes with panic, sometimes with mercy, sometimes with punishment. The balance still shifts. In a narrow gaslit laboratory in Elberfeld at the turn of the century, where glass and flame and the faint sweet tang of acetic anhydride hung in the air like an incense that promised relief, chemists at Bayer coaxed a new shape from an old friend. Morphine had been reliable for decades, the blunt instrument that soothed wounds and steadied nerves, but it had its temper, and physicians fretted over its habitualness. So Felix Hoffmann, the same practical hand who would later be praised for refining aspirin, and Heinrich Drieser, Bayer's pharmacologist with an eye for marketable miracles, took the morphine molecule, acetylated it, and called the result diacetyl morphine. Bayer trademarked it as heroin in 1898, a name meant to conjure heroic relief. They promised a gentler, safer alternative to morphine's rough embrace, a cough suppressant that would not enthrall the will. It was, in their advertisements and in the quiet, earnest columns of trade journals, an answer to morphine's problems. Less cough, less dependence. The company sent samples to physicians across Europe and North America, and for a while the world accepted the story. It would have been a better bedtime tale if the molecule cared about marketing copy, if it took instruction from a chemist's memo. It did not. The very chemical alteration that made diacetyl morphine more soluble in fat, and therefore faster to cross the blood-brain barrier, made it act more quickly and in most cases more impetily, delivering a euphoric rush that many found not less addictive than morphine, but more liable to capture attention. The discovery itself was not even novel. Years earlier, in 1874, a British chemist named C.R. Alder Wright had tried acetylating morphine at St Mary's Hospital in London and observed a similar compound. What Hoffmann and Drieser did with German industrial efficiency at the dawn of a new pharmaceutical age was package that chemistry into a brand and ship it everywhere, to convalescent homes, to general practitioners, to the 19th century equivalent of a paediatrician's cabinet for intractable cough. When a substance is quick and pleasant in its onset, physicians find their patients asking for it twice, then 3 times. That is biology. That is human desire. That is business. The reaction was predictably bureaucratic and quietly brutal. Where a company had promised a medical fix, societies and governments saw a social problem. Where doctors had hoped for a less troublesome analgesic, families reported dependence. Within 2 decades, a chorus of public health alarms and moral panic had turned to law. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 began the process of regulating opiates, imposing taxes and paperwork that in practice made casual supplies difficult, if not impossible, to maintain. Other nations moved in parallel or through international compacts as the League of Nations and successor bodies tried to craft rules to keep pharmacology from outrunning social policy. Heroin, which once had been sold over counters and recommended for morphine withdrawal, was recast as a social menace. The turn from therapeutic optimism to restrictive law in the early 20th century is a small example of a repeating pattern. Medicine makes an advance. Society absorbs it only after it has become a problem. Regulation lags. The impetus to innovate continues regardless. And innovate they did. The 20th century became a long laboratory of subtle molecular sculpture, a century in which chemists learned to nibble at opium's many alkaloids and to assemble wholly synthetic scaffolds that imitated the analgesic virtues of morphine while attempting to discard its faults. Where morphine's molecules had been taken from poppy sap, chemists would look later to codeine and the bane for inspiration, to acetylation and reduction, to ring rearrangements and substitutions. Germany again was a crucible for many of these reforms. In 1916, in the laboratories clustered around the universities and chemical houses that had long fed the world's pharmacopoeia, scientists transformed the bane into oxyderivatives that would later appear in clinics under names familiar to every pharmacist. In their 30s and 40s, amid the geopolitical storms that made standard supplies precarious, chemists at IG Farben, a corporation whose industrial reach and moral culpability would long be debated after the war, synthesized a new agent, methadone, in 1937. Max Bockmuhl and Gustav Erhardt are credited with assembling that compound, which was structurally unrelated to morphine and, when taken orally, had a long half-life that made it useful for steady analgesia and later for maintenance therapy and opioid dependence. Methadone's trajectory is instructive because it shows the duality of pharmaceutical intention and social consequence. In laboratories it was a triumph, a synthetic analgesic that could be manufactured without opium, useful for a world that might not always have safe, consistent access to poppy crops in wartime. In clinics it became both analgesic and social policy tool. By the 60s, Vincent Dole and Marie Nies, working in New York, discovered that methadone, given in steady doses, could blunt heroin cravings and allow addicted people to rebuild lives. Their work led to methadone maintenance programs that recast addiction from moral failing to treatable chronic condition. The relief came at a cost. Methadone's long half-life and complex interactions with other drugs made dosing treacherous, and its proliferation required new forms of regulation and a reimagining of outpatient treatment. Once again, an innovation intended to solve one set of problems, dependence, variable supply, inadequate analgesia, created a new set of problems, a potent maintenance drug whose misuse could be lethal if mishandled. Other chemists pursued different aims and produced other tools. Meperidine, known in Anglo-American hospitals as pethidine, arrived around the middle of the century as a synthetic analgesic that looked and felt different under the tongue and in the syringe. Its neurotoxic metabolite limited long-term use. In the 1960s, a Belgian pharmacologist, Paul Janssen, introduced a synthetic called fentanyl, which was quietly magnificent in its potency. A molecule shaped to bind tightly and act fast, 100 times as strong as morphine and thus well suited to surgery, anesthesia, and the brief targeted suppression of severe pain. Fentanyl and its congeners, alfentanil, sufentanil, remifentanil, fit the needs of modern operating theatres where rapid control of nociception is required and where duration, potency and pharmacokinetics can be chosen like tools from a kit. They were perfect for a technologically sophisticated medicine. They were less perfect for a world in which pills and powders might be diverted, combined or sold on the black market. It is the pattern. I said we would see again and again a pharmaceutical goal to refine analgesia, faster onset, fewer side effects, easier manufacturing, produces a molecule with a novel profile, and that novelty includes new ways for bodies and societies to misuse or be harmed by it. Each generation of opioids rearranged the calculus of risk. Heroin reached the brain faster than morphine and found new users. Methadone smoothed withdrawal but required vigilant supervision. Fentanyl's potency made it invaluable in the operating room and dangerous in the street. And as these compounds multiplied, national drug schedules and international treaties scrambled to respond. The law could restrict a known molecule, but chemists could always tinker at atomic edges to create molecular cousins that fell outside definitions, a cat-and-mouse game played in laboratories and courtrooms alike. This same pattern threaded through the second half of the century into the practice of medicine itself, where morphine, the old stalwart, kept a kind of battered dignity. In modern clinical work, morphine did not disappear. It simply assumed new roles and new rituals. Anesthesia began to rely on a broader pharmacopoeia for induction and for post-operative comfort, and yet morphine remained essential for acute pain control in emergency rooms, for titrated post-operative relief, and above all in palliative care, where its steady, time-honoured capacity to soothe severe suffering made it almost mythic. The World Health Organization's analgesic ladder, published in 1986, codified a simple and humane approach to cancer pain. Start with non-opioids for mild pain, move to weak opioids for moderate pain, and reserve strong opioids, morphine among them, for severe or refractory pain. That ladder was not a prescriptive law so much as a moral injunction. Treat pain, treat it aggressively enough to restore function, or at least dignity, and do not deny opioids to those in true suffering. In clinics from Massachusetts to Mumbai, this ladder became a framework that guided prescribing, education, and the slow expansion of palliative services. It was simple, and that simplicity mattered in places with few resources and in bustling hospitals alike. Clinically, morphine's administration matured into evidence-based choreography, titration by the minute in the emergency room, bolus and lockout strategies in patient-controlled analgesia, pumps on surgical wards, slow-release formulations for chronic pain when used at all, and intravenous infusions for palliative care when oral absorption was unreliable. Start low, go slow. Those three words have become a small liturgy in geriatric wards where pharmacokinetics are capricious and sensitivity to central nervous system depressants is high. For the elderly, the frail, and those with impaired renal function, morphine is to be dosed as if on a narrow bridge, measured and cautious. The pharmacology is unkind in detail but truthful. Morphine is metabolized in the liver into morphine-6-glucuronide and morphine-3-glucuronide, metabolites which tell a story about benefit and harm. M6G contributes to analgesia and yet accumulates when kidneys fail. M3G can provoke neuroexcitation and does not soothe. Clinicians learn to respect that chemistry. When kidneys falter, they consider fentanyl or methadone because those compounds, differently shaped, leave fewer dangerous residues behind. When the elderly complain of pain after surgery, clinicians give smaller boluses and wait to see if the dreadful thing will pass rather than drown a small, stubborn life in sedation. Titration strategies in acute care are practical and direct. For severe pain, intravenous morphine in measured boluses of a few milligrams may be given and repeated every few minutes until satisfactory analgesia is achieved, with conscious monitoring of respiratory rate and sedation. For ongoing infusion or PCA, the concept is to maintain effective plasma concentrations with the minimum necessary exposure, to avoid the oscillations that produce peaks of euphoria and valleys of withdrawal, and to make the patient an active participant rather than a passive receptor of opioids. In chronic non-cancer pain, the evidence base narrows and the clinical judgments widen. Long-term opioid therapy can work for some patients with neuropathic pain or degenerative disease, but high-quality trials have not demonstrated robust, durable benefits for many causes of chronic musculoskeletal pain, and the risks, tolerance, opioid-induced hyperalgesia, hormonal disruption, diversion, and the spectre of addiction loom large in the calculus. So clinicians rely on a suite of approaches. Non-pharmacologic therapies like physiotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, adjuvant medications such as certain antidepressants and anticonvulsants for neuropathic pain, targeted interventions like local anesthetic blocks, and, when opioids are used, formal agreements, regular reviews of function and pain scores, urine drug testing and prescription monitoring to catch diversion. The World Health Organization's ladder instructs and moralizes, but chaperones and constraints are now part of prescribing. Some institutions require pain agreements, some clinicians mandate naloxone co-prescription for those on high opioid doses, and many hospitals use pharmacy surveillance to flag risky combinations, like benzodiazepines with opioids, which are a recipe for respiratory disaster. Palliative care, perhaps more than any other field, demonstrates morphine's human utility. In terminal cancer and intractable dyspnea, morphine reduces distress. It eases the breathing and the fear of breathing. On hospice wards in Nairobi and New York alike, morphine's presence is a comfort both literal and symbolic, and yet the global distribution of morphine is embarrassingly unequal. The same molecule that is routine in Western hospices is often scarce in low and middle-income countries, where regulation, fear of diversion, and logistical obstacles leave patients in needless suffering. The World Health Organization has long listed morphine on its essential medicines list precisely because it is inexpensive and effective. Policy efforts continue to try to unclench regulatory fist and let clinicians relieve pain without excessive bureaucratic hurdle. Those medical realities, the pharmacology, the protocols, the palliative imperatives, exist alongside a political and industrial history that in the late 20th century pushed opioid prescribing far beyond the narrow confines it once occupied. After the Second World War, medicine's attention to chronic pain increased. Pioneers like John J. Bonacker championed multidisciplinary pain clinics and argued that chronic pain should be treated as a medical condition deserving of consistent attention, not dismissed as moral failing. That was humane and right, and it opened clinical doors. What followed was a convergence, like two rivers joining, of shifting medical concepts, evolving clinical guidelines, and an industry eager to supply solutions. Where once opioids were a tool for the acute, they became a treatment for the chronic, and where once specialists alone dispensed them, primary care physicians too were persuaded to embrace them. There were a few missteps that deserve blunt mention, because they were consequential. In 1980, a brief letter to the New England Journal of Medicine by researchers Porter and Jick noted that addiction was rare among hospitalized patients given narcotics. It was a 5-sentence communication about contextually limited data, but it became a totem, quoted as if a controlled trial had declared opioids benign. Some pain specialists in the 80s and 90s, convinced by clinical compassion and often by industry-sponsored rhetoric, argued that opioids could be safely and effectively prescribed for chronic non-cancer pain with appropriate safeguards. The evidence for long-term benefit was thin, but the enthusiasm was broad and the marketing more so. When in 1996 an American company named Purdue Pharma introduced a time-release oxycodone product and promoted it aggressively, the scales tipped. Sales representatives visited doctors. Continuing medical education events spoke of improved function and underplayed addiction risk. The pills were convenient, their slow-release nature advertised as a guard against abuse, a claim whose logic would be exposed when addicts learned to defeat tablet designs, or when the sheer abundance of prescribed pills provided a ready supply for diversion. This is where strategy and logistics become grimly important. The expansion of prescription opioid availability had a predictable arithmetic. More prescription meant more pills circulating in medicine cabinets, emergency rooms, and the pockets of people in pain or in temptation. Diversion followed prescribing. Social networks passed pills from the legitimately treated to others. Some patients found themselves on a treadmill of tolerance and dose escalation. Some ran out of legal options and turned to the illicit market. Regulation and public health responses were slow to catch up. Prescription monitoring programs, which allow prescribers and pharmacists to check a patient's controlled substance history, were rolled out state by state in the United States in the early 2000s, but were not ubiquitous. The concept of pain as the fifth vital sign, a phrase that achieved policy status in the 1990s and early 2000s, encouraging routine pain assessment in hospitals, carried with it a bureaucratic demand for measured pain scores and sometimes for quick fixes that doctors could provide in the shape of a pill. The result was measurable. Over the last decades of the 20th century and into the next, opioid prescribing rose steeply in many high-income countries, especially in the United States, where a combination of medical culture, aggressive pharmaceutical promotion, and patient expectation produced what historians will call an era of prescription opioid abundance. That abundance brought with it increased exposures, increased diversion, a growing population vulnerable to dependence, and ultimately a spike in overdoses that would reshape public discourse about pain and addiction. It is not the story of a single villain. It is the story of a confluence. Scientists and marketers in labs and boardrooms, clinicians who wanted to relieve legitimate suffering and were sold a simplified narrative of safety, regulatory frameworks that were coherent for the last century's molecules but not fully attuned to a new generation, and patients whose human desire to be free of pain met chemistry's unpredictable invitation. Through all these shifts, the spectre of soldier's disease, that old name for morphine dependence first coined after the Civil War and again whispered in World War I, remained as a historical echo, a reminder that medicine's solutions can sit like latent seeds, waiting for circumstances that make them bloom into trouble. The 20th century's chemical ingenuity had improved relief in countless useful ways, and the same ingenuity had opened new doors to misuse. In the end, the history of morphine and its heirs is neither a parable of inevitable decline, nor an elegy for a lost purity. It is a complicated ledger of gains and liabilities, of relief granted and vulnerabilities created, of clinicians and chemists both doing work they believe to be good, and of social systems that sometimes fail to foresee the sum of their separate choices. If one looks closely, one sees also the institutional responses that followed the prescription era. Clinical guidelines that try to re-establish balance, stewardship programs that teach careful prescribing and tapering, naloxone distribution campaigns to reverse overdose in the street, and litigation that forced corporate accountability for deceptive claims. Physicians have had to relearn old cautions and invent new protocols to screen, to document, to set goals with patients to favour non-opioid treatments where evidence suggests benefit, and to measure outcomes not merely as pain scores but as return to function, to work, to sleep, to the small filaments of life that pain so often severs. Pain specialists who once championed wider opioid use have become some of the most vocal advocates for careful, measured prescribing. The moral is not that opioids are evil or that they are panacea. The moral is that powerful molecules bend society, and society must learn to bend back with systems that respect both relief and risk. So the 20th century closes with a certain tired wisdom, that innovation is never purely additive, that every new analgesic carries a shadow it did not intend, and that regulation and clinical prudence must be as nimble as chemistry. The bedside remains a place of delicate negotiations between receptor and remedy, between patient and prescriber, between science and social consequence. Morphine, which began as a miracle to some and a danger to others, remains with us in hospitals and hospices, in syringes and slow-release tablets, in national formularies and in the quiet of rooms where people are being eased towards sleep. The story of its derivatives is a long string of attempts to refine suffering into something manageable, and of the inevitable human foible that turns some remedies into new anxieties. If the lessons are wearying, they are also necessary. In medicine, as in life, there is no simple cure for complexity, only a careful, patient architecture of systems that must learn from the past while holding the future lightly, like a cup of hot tea. By the closing decades of the 20th century, a familiar and oddly patient shadow had stretched across hospitals, clinics, and living rooms. Opioids, once the concentrated essence of morphine's long life, were no longer a medicine heard of only in the hush of the ward and in the language of surgeons and palliativists, but an ordinary domestic presence. The move from morphine to an era dominated by prescription opioids was not sudden. It was cumulative, like the quiet softening of a shoreline by tide upon tide. It had clinical arguments, voices in pain medicine declaring that chronic suffering deserved the same seriousness as cancer pain, and cultural ones, a rising emphasis on patient satisfaction and quality of life metrics that crept into accreditation standards. There were specific names and dates, moments that could be pointed to like lit windows in that long dusk. Russell K. Portnoy and Mariti Foley's 1986 paper arguing that carefully managed opioid therapy could be used for non-malignant chronic pain. The arrival of OxyContin from Purdue Farms in 1996. Its extended-release promise packaged and marketed with gusto. The late 1980s campaigns urging clinicians to treat pain more aggressively, and the Joint Commission's late 90s insistence that pain assessment become routine, a fifth vital sign. These were decisions made in offices and boardrooms and in the slow corridors of medical culture, and that they reshaped supply, practice, and expectation. The consequence, as surveillance would make plain 2 decades later, was a 3-part crisis. Public health analysts, most visibly in the United States through the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, began to speak of 3 waves of opioid-related mortality. The first wave, beginning in the 90s and cresting through the 2000s, was propelled by prescription opioids, oxycodone, hydrocodone, methadone used as analgesic therapy, whose sales and prescriptions rose sharply as prescribers and patients embraced them as safe and modern remedies for pain. The second wave, beginning around 2010, saw heroin replace prescription pills as the lethal opioid of the street, a substitution driven in part by changes in the legal supply, reformulations of prescription drugs that made them harder to crush or inject, tighter prescribing rules and state-level monitoring that constricted the more casual flows of pills, and the simple arithmetic that when a legal supply dries up, demand often seeks an illegal one that is cheaper and easier to find. Then the third and far more lethal wave arrived in the mid-2010s, illicitly manufactured fentanyl and its analogues, tiny and terrifyingly potent molecules, folded into heroin, pressed into counterfeit tablets pretending to be oxycodone, or sold as powder or in capsules. Fentanyl's potency, often described in clinical literature as 10s to perhaps 100 times that of morphine, meant that a few grains could produce dozens or hundreds of doses, an economy of dosage that drove traffickers to favour it and public health authorities to watch in dread as mortality curves rose. This trajectory, prescriptions to heroin to fentanyl, was not purely American, though the United States became the most widely studied case, and the one whose epidemiology dominated headlines. Canada followed parallel lines, especially in provinces such as British Columbia and Ontario, where high prescribing rates in the 2000s preceded devastating outbreaks of fentanyl-related deaths in the 2010s. Australia and parts of Northern Europe saw increases in prescription opioid misuse and opioid-related harms, but the raw combination of massive prescribing, pharmaceutical marketing, and a porous illicit market made the US experience uniquely concentrated. The illicit supply dynamics were decisive. Fentanyl did not so much emerge as an alternative as it multiplied into the supply, adulterating what had once been heroin, turning cocaine and methamphetamine into more dangerous cocktails when mixed, and flooding counterfeit opioid pills manufactured in clandestine labs across Mexico and with precursors sourced through syndicates in Asia. The globalization of supply chains, chemical precursors shipped in small parcels, clandestine production in semi-industrial compounds, distribution through networks both conventional and online, gave the crisis a logistical cunning that made it harder to plug with local policy alone. Surveillance data told the story in cold, incremental numbers that, joined together, read like a ledger of loss. Mortality rose in waves. geographically concentrated in places whose social and economic fabric had frayed. Appalachia, parts of New England, industrial towns that had lost factories and the steady rhythms of daily work, communities where opioid prescribing had been high for chronic pain among miners, truckers, and other labourers exposed to injury. At first, the epidemic was described with a demographic shorthand that many commentators still use: white, rural, working-class, middle-aged men. That description was not wrong in its time, but it was incomplete and eventually misleading, because the supply dynamics and the entry of fentanyl changed who died. Once a drug of such potency began to contaminate urban drug markets and cocaine supplies, overdose mortality rose sharply among Black and Latinx communities in many metropolitan centres. The epidemic also broadened across age and gender. Young adults, women and older adults all registered rising rates of overdose at different moments, and the racialized patterns of response, treatment, incarceration, media framing, echoed older, uncomfortable truths about who society chooses to heal and who it punishes. Emergency responses evolved haltingly, and sometimes with an experimental quality, a trial and error of policy that mixed public health tools with law enforcement strategies. Naloxone, the opioid antagonist capable of reversing respiratory depression in minutes, moved from a niche hospital medication to a community lifesaver. Distributed to first responders, police officers, and increasingly to lay people by community organisations and public health programs, naloxone became a talisman against the rising tide of deaths. Good Samaritan laws canvassed by state legislatures offered legal protection to those who called for help during an overdose, and standing orders, pharmacy-based dispensing, and public distribution programs expanded access. At the same time, prescription monitoring programs, state-level databases intended to track controlled substance prescriptions and identify doctor shopping, were rolled out, and many states enacted laws to limit pill mills and to require prescribers to check databases. The CDC's 2016 guideline for prescribing opioids for chronic pain was a notable inflection point. It offered concrete recommendations to reduce overprescribing, encouraged non-opioid alternatives, and later was invoked, sometimes misapplied, in efforts to taper patients off long-term therapy. Some of these supply-side changes were encouraged by litigation. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, lawsuits against pharmaceutical manufacturers and distributors multiplied, accusing companies of misleading the medical community about addiction risks and oversupplying opioids to pharmacies in suspicious patterns. Those legal battles, culminating in settlements and bankruptcy filings for companies like Purdue in the late 2010s, held corporate actors to account in the public imagination, although the reparative impact on public health infrastructure and communities has been uneven and delayed. The market's return to heroin after prescription reformulations illustrates the principle, so often true in drug policy, that supply restriction without broad access to treatment can shift harm rather than eliminate it. When OxyContin was reformulated in 2010 to resist crushing and injection, many users who had grown dependent found that their accustomed supply had become unreliable. For some, heroin was a cheaper and more accessible substitute, and heroin's street economy was ready to meet demand. Then fentanyl arrived like a shape-shifting predator. Illicitly manufactured fentanyl could be produced in small, efficient labs and smuggled in small quantities that translated into huge numbers of doses. It could be pressed into pills that imitated prescription opioids so convincingly that users who had once trusted the brand name of a pill might swallow a tablet containing no oxycodone at all and nothing but a lethal dose of a synthetic opioid. The speed with which the drug supply changed was one of the great practical challenges for public health. Surveillance systems, medical examiners' reports, toxicology labs, hospital emergency departments, and the sentinel monitoring of law enforcement often lagged weeks or months behind the real-time shifts in what was being sold on street corners and online. That lag meant that communities could be blind to an incoming wave until it had already claimed lives. By the time the third wave had fully flowered in many urban centres, the crisis demanded a response that was no longer purely clinical. Overdose prevention required new logistics. broad distribution of naloxone, training of non-medical responders, the redesign of emergency medical systems to treat overdoses as triage points into care rather than discrete episodes, the integration of addiction treatment into hospitals. It required social logistics as well, housing, employment assistance, mental health services, and the removal of legal barriers that pushed people who use drugs to the margins. It also required an unglamorous kind of surveillance, the expansion of toxicology capabilities to identify fentanyl analogues, the coordination of data across jurisdictions, the sharing of early warning reports so that public health officials could warn hospitals and clinicians of an influx of more potent substances. The paradox, cruel in its simplicity, was that what saved many lives in the moment, naloxone rapid emergency response, did not by itself solve the underlying drivers of dependence and the social vulnerabilities that sustained it. Out of these horrors and logistical failures, a body of practice and research slowly matured. What would come to be known as harm reduction and medication-assisted therapy took on new urgency and broader acceptance. Methadone maintenance had been around for decades since the 1960s, established as a treatment for heroin dependence that reduced illicit use and criminal activity and improved social functioning, though its availability was tightly regulated and often stigmatized. Buprenorphine, approved in the United States in 2002 following the 2000 Drug Addiction Treatment Act that allowed for office-based prescribing, offered a partial agonist alternative that could be prescribed by trained physicians outside of specialized clinics. It promised greater accessibility, though early regulatory constraints such as the X waiver and patient caps limited rapid scale-up. Naltrexone and its extended-release formulations provided an opioid antagonist option for some patients, and the suite of medication-assisted treatments, methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone, accumulated a strong evidence base. Observational studies and randomized trials in many contexts showed these medications reduced illicit opioid use, improved retention in care, and most importantly lowered the risk of fatal overdose. Harm reduction measures that once faced fierce resistance gradually won scientific vindication, and in places, political acceptance. Syringe service programs, first instituted in the 1980s in Western Europe and then adopted in North America in the 90s, reduced HIV transmission among people who inject drugs and provided points of contact for offering treatment and other services. Supervised consumption sites, small staffed rooms where individuals could use drugs under medical observation, became a lightning rod in public debate. Yet the empirical record in cities like Vancouver, where Insight opened in 2003, showed reductions in overdose deaths within the facility, higher uptake of detox and treatment services by patrons, and no clear increase in local crime. Those outcomes did not end political controversy. No public health measure ever entirely does, but they reframed the conversation away from moral judgment and toward evidence about what measured reductions in mortality and morbidity look like. The policy debates have often pitched harm reduction against punitive strategies, and the clash is as much morale and symbolic as it is practical. In many countries, the war on drugs model, criminalize, incarcerate, disrupt supply, remains politically easier to sell than a program that gives free sterile syringes, hands out naloxone, or offers medically prescribed heroin to certain treatment-resistant patients. Yet the evidence from Portugal, which in 2001 shifted from criminalization to decriminalization for possession of all drugs and invested heavily in treatment and harm reduction, is frequently invoked as a corrective. Overdose deaths, HIV transmission rates, and problematic drug use decreased in the years after reform, even as broad-based recreational use did not skyrocket. Switzerland's experimental programs of the 90s that included heroin-assisted therapy with medical-grade diamorphine and low-threshold services in several cities brought down crime, improved health outcomes, and provided a model for targeted, compassionate responses to entrenched dependence. Canada conducted clinical trials, including the North American Opiate Medication Initiative, NAOMI, in the mid-2000s and subsequent studies that showed heroin-assisted treatment could be effective for highly refractory cases. All of these examples encouraged a rethinking of what public health instruments might do when untethered from punitive logics. barriers to scaling up best practices have been stubborn, and many are administrative or legal rather than technical. Methadone is still delivered under highly regulated dispensary systems in many countries. Buprenorphine prescribing has been constrained by training requirements, caps on patient numbers, and stigma in the medical profession. Many jurisdictions permitted syringe service programs but restricted federal funding for them for years, hampering their reach. Supervised consumption sites have continued to face legal challenges in the United States under federal statutes that make maintaining a place for drug use a felony in the eyes of some prosecutors. As a result, some cities have been forced into creative workarounds or slow judicial fights to open services that public health experts say save lives. Stigma among clinicians, law enforcement, and the public remains one of the most pernicious barriers because people who need care are often those most affected by social shame and fear of legal consequences. In the years of crisis, pragmatic policy changes sometimes arrive through unusual vectors. The HIV epidemic had already taught public health that reducing needle sharing saved lives. The fentanyl crisis taught it that distributing naloxone broadly and training non-medical responders to use it would bend mortality curves. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a second set of pragmatic adaptations occurred. Regulators relaxed rules to allow telemedicine initiation of buprenorphine, and many places increased take-home doses of methadone to reduce clinic crowding. These changes, implemented as emergency measures, demonstrated that long-standing regulatory strictures could be loosened without catastrophic outcomes, and they provided ammunition for advocates seeking permanent reform. They also revealed programmatic constraints. Telemedicine can reach people with phones and stable addresses, but the most marginalized, those experiencing homelessness, severe mental illness, or chronic poverty, need in-person wraparound services that are not easily substituted by a video visit. Evidence accumulated steadily that some of the strategies favored by harm reductionists worked. Medication-assisted therapy reduced overdose mortality. Naloxone distribution saved lives at the community level. Syringe services reduced HIV and enabled engagement with care. Supervised consumption sites reduced death at the site and linked people to social and medical services. These are not matters of ideology but of outcome. They do not erase the complexity of dependency nor the legitimate desire of clinicians to prevent iatrogenic harm. Yet the best practice recommendations distilled from observational studies, randomized trials and program evaluations have clear contours. Expand access to evidence-based medications, remove needless regulatory obstacles that prevent clinicians from prescribing them, distribute naloxone widely, provide sterile injecting supplies, and create low-barrier pathways from harm reduction services to treatment and social supports. The debate, therefore, is less about whether these tools work and more about how society chooses to allocate resources, alter laws, and accept certain forms of management of risk. Some political actors have preferred a narrative of criminality, more policing, more incarceration, which often sidelines the health system investments that would bring sustained reductions in mortality. Other actors, mindful of the failures of supply-only approaches, advocate for a public health path. Universal availability of medication-assisted therapy, sustained funding for syringe programs and supervised consumption, and bold moves like safe supply pilots, programs that provide regulated, pharmaceutical alternatives to illicit fentanyl for highly at-risk individuals. Evidence for safe supply is still accumulating, and jurisdictions like British Columbia have mounted experiments during the worst waves of their outbreaks. The ethical justification is simple. When the unregulated supply will likely kill, provide a safer regulated alternative while building pathways to social supports and recovery. That transition from immediate crisis response to a longer-term reframing of addiction and pain management leads into the most reflective part of the story. How morphine's long history, its brilliance in anesthesia and palliative care, its role in 19th century armies where it birthed the phrase soldier's disease, leads us to where we stand now and what we might do differently in the future. Morphine was, and often is, a miracle drug. It has allowed surgeons to work without the patient feeling the rawness of incision. It has made possible humane end-of-life care. It has been central to emergency medicine and obstetrics in many parts of the world. Yet that miracle carries a double edge. The same biological pathway that so effectively quiets pain can, in different social and economic contexts, become a pathway into dependence when supply, prescribing culture, and social supports are misaligned. The history of opioids teaches a series of hard lessons. One is humility. The introduction of a new medicine, especially so one that alters subjective states, always ripples outward in unpredictable ways. Another is the importance of systems thinking. Narrow interventions to restrict supply without expanding treatment and social supports will often displace harm into other forms or other substances. A third lesson is the interplay of stigma and policy. How society narrates the people who use drugs matters to policy choices, funding allocations, and political courage. Where drug use is framed primarily as moral failing or criminality, the policy repertoire narrows to punishment. Where it is framed as a public health problem, a wider set of interventions, harm reduction, treatment, social services become plausible and politically attainable. Looking forward, the future of pain medicine and addiction care sketches at a landscape that is both technological and ethical. On the pharmacological front, researchers have been exploring biased agonists, molecules designed to preferentially activate certain intracellular signaling pathways at the mu opioid receptor, thought to produce analgesia while minimizing pathways associated with respiratory depression and tolerance. Olicaridine, sometimes discussed in press as an example, was an early clinical attempt in this direction, and though it has not been a panacea, it signals a new era of receptor pharmacology that is more nuanced than the high-dose, single-target approaches of earlier opioid therapy. Beyond biased agonists, a constellation of alternative analgesic strategies is maturing. Peripherally acting compounds that limit central effects, novel cannabinoids under careful study, monoclonal antibodies for headache disorders, NMDA antagonists like low-dose ketamine for certain refractory pain states, and neuromodulation devices, implanted stimulators and external neurostimulation that can manage chronic pain without systemic opioids. Precision medicine holds promise as well. Better phenotyping of pain states, more reliable biomarkers and pharmacogenomic testing could help clinicians predict who is likely to respond to an opioid and who is at greater risk of adverse outcomes. Decision support tools embedded in electronic health records linked to prescription drug monitoring programs can help clinicians make safer, evidence-informed choices about when to initiate or continue opioid therapy. But technology alone will not answer the social questions that underlie much of the burden of addiction. Housing instability, untreated mental illness, economic precarity, and social isolation. Policy reform, therefore, must remain central. The future that seems most humane and practical is one that balances two imperatives that have seemed at odds: guaranteeing timely and effective relief for those with serious pain, cancer, acute post-operative pain, severe trauma, while preventing the development of iatrogenic dependence and rapidly identifying and treating those who develop opioid use disorder. Achieving that balance will require structural reforms, more training for clinicians in pain management and addiction medicine, removal of unnecessary regulatory hurdles to the prescription of medication-assisted therapies, expansion of reimbursement for non-pharmacologic treatments, physical therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, interdisciplinary pain programs, and robust funding for harm reduction services. Memory, too, will shape policy. The cultural story of morphine, its reputation as a miracle drug and its shadow as a generator of dependence, will have to be taught honestly in medical schools, public health programs, and in the press. The phrase soldier's disease, a 19th century lament for morphine dependence among veterans, should not be an obdurate relic but a cautionary tale. That medical necessity in one moment can become social affliction in another if systems do not adapt. Memory can be corrective. It can spur litigation that funds treatment programs. It can humble pharmaceutical marketers and it can inform lawmaking that favours sustained public health infrastructure over ephemeral suppression. There are promising policy experiments that speak to this synthesis. Decriminalisation in Portugal, expanded safe supply pilots in Canada, heroin-assisted treatment programs in parts of Europe, and widening availability of naloxone and buprenorphine in the United States all suggest different ways societies have sought to square care with control. Each of these experiments is messy. Each carries trade-offs and political risk. But what unites the most successful initiatives is an ethic of inclusion, treating people who use drugs as subjects of care rather than objects of isolation or punishment. If there is a final practical note to this long story, it is that the work of balancing access to pain relief with the prevention of harm is not a one-time engineering problem, but an ongoing governance task that requires vigilance, humility, and the willingness to learn from both data and lived experience. Systems need to be designed so that early warning signals, an uptick in overdoses in a neighbourhood, a surge in counterfeit pills, are rapidly shared across public health, clinical care, law enforcement, and community organisations. Funding streams must be reliable rather than episodic, because harm reduction work is slow and relationship-based. Clinicians must be trained not only in prescribing and tapering, but in recognising the social determinants of health that make some patients more vulnerable. And society must find ways to reduce stigma, because stigma is the invisible policy barrier that deflects resources and isolates people at precisely the moments when help would be most effective. Beyond the practical, there is a quieter responsibility to remember morphine's contradictions without caricature, to remember that morphine has alleviated unbearable suffering for millions, that for surgeons in the 19th century and anaesthetists in the 20th, it was a godsend that enabled procedures inconceivable in an earlier age, that for families and hospice nurses it has provided compassion in the last hours of life, and to remember too that the social systems we create around a medicine, marketing, prescribing cultures, regulatory safeguards, social supports, are as determinative of public health as the molecules themselves. So when we stand at the bedside of the contemporary opioid crisis, what we see is not merely a wave of chemistry and commerce, but a human geography. Patients in pain who need connection, communities that need services, clinicians who need tools and safe rules, policymakers who must choose between slogans and evidence. The future will carry new molecules, perhaps better targeted analgesics and more sophisticated therapeutics, and it will carry old human constants: grief, relief, the wish to be free from pain. If the past has taught anything, it is that miracle drugs can illuminate human possibility and, if we are careless, human frailty. We can choose with knowledge and care to frame policy so that miracles are administered within systems that prevent avoidable harm. It is not in the end merely a technical or pharmacological problem, it is a civic one, and as with any careful task it will be done best and most humanely by people who tend to the work like lantern bearers, steady, watchful and ready to adjust course when the weather turns.